The 1918 NHL season was the first season of the league, and it was pretty wild. There was some really unusual and crazy stuff that happened that season, so today we'll be taking a look at the first ever NHL season. Also, shout out to Hectic Hockey and Odd Man Rush for the inspiration for this video. Their channel links are in the description. Before we get into the weird stuff, we'll quickly take a look at the basic info of this season. The league leader in goals was Joe Malone with 44 goals. There was a four-way tie for league leader in assists between Harry Cameron, Corb Denny, Cy Denny, and Reg Noble, who got 10 assists each. Although he only got 4 assists, Joe Malone also led the league in points with 48. The season started out with 4 teams and ended with 3, which I'll explain why later. The season was split into 2 halves, with the Montreal Canadiens winning the first half, and the Toronto Maple Leafs, then the Toronto Arenas, winning the second half. Then the Canadiens and the Arenas played in the finals for the NHL Championship. The Arenas won the championship and then went on to beat the Vancouver Millionaires of the PCHA to win the Stanley Cup. Now we get into the weird stuff, and even the way the NHL was formed was pretty weird. At the time, the biggest hockey league in the world was the NHA, which stood for National Hockey Association. In the NHA, Eddie Livingstone owned 2 teams, which were the Toronto Shamrocks and the Toronto Blue Shirts. However, he was making some very questionable moves as the owner of these teams, like moving all the best players from the Shamrocks to the Blue Shirts, which obviously made the Shamrocks a dumpster fire of a team. Eventually, the league had enough of this and stripped Livingstone of the Shamrocks, who then found a new owner. Livingstone would continue to make questionable moves, and the league tried to make him sell the Blue Shirts, but he refused. Eventually, the owners of the other teams in the league hated Livingstone so much that they decided to create a whole new league just to get away from him. So the NHL was created with 4 teams. Those teams were the Montreal Canadiens, the Toronto Arenas, the Ottawa Senators, and finally, the Montreal Wanderers. However, the Montreal Wanderers did not last long in the NHL. On January 2nd, 1918, the Montreal Arena, which was the Wanderers and the Canadiens arena, unfortunately burnt down. The fire was caused by faulty wiring in the ice-making plant. Luckily, there were no injuries from the fire, and there was almost no one in the building at the time. There was almost $150,000 worth of damages in the fire, which included the equipment of both the Canadiens and the Wanderers. The Canadiens were able to find a new arena and new equipment, however the Wanderers weren't so lucky. Since they already sucked and only won 1 game so far that season, they just decided to disband the team instead of going through the trouble of getting a new arena and equipment. On January 28, 1918, we saw another weird event take place. In a game between the Montreal Canadiens and the Toronto Arenas for the NHL Championship, Joe Hall and Alf Skinner got into a pretty heated battle. They started to swing their sticks around and using them like swords and trying to hit each other in the head. Hockey sticks at the time weighed over 5 pounds, so they were really lucky neither of them got seriously hurt. Both Hall and Skinner would appear in Toronto court the next day on January 29th, and they both got fined $15, which is the equivalent to about $300 today. After that, the inaugural season of the NHL came to a close, and it definitely was one for the history books. The 1918 NHL season was nothing short of crazy. The NHL has come a very long way since then, and now the average NHL team is worth a whopping $1 billion. Although it didn't start off too great, the NHL would go on to become the best hockey league in the world with a very rich history.